Oh, I just love this. We're just laughing about how awkward that moment is when we're waiting for this meeting is recorded thing to happen before we actually start the conversation.
Yeah.
So welcome to everybody who's made it their mission to join us today for today's topic about how to be a receiver of feedback. We love the idea of creating a culture of feedback, and that only comes if everyone's comfortable giving and receiving feedback, or as I like to call it, guidance, just because I think it softens the language a little bit. Our previous conversations around this topic have been around the importance of giving feedback, how to ask for feedback, and now today, how to graciously receive feedback. I mean, the reality is that feedback is really part of how we work. We receive multiple points of feedback every single day, and sometimes probably don't even think of it as feedback, that scary term. It can be simple as a quick comment after a meeting, or it can be a more detailed and structured discussion about how we're doing and what we can do to improve. But before we get into the digging deeper part, which is what this webinar is all about, let's take a moment for a few brief introductions. So if you've been part of this series before, you'll recognize me. My name is Raina Fryer. I'm the Senior Director of People and Learning. I come from 20 years of experience with people around training and facilitation, coaching through my own business practice where I coach women in leadership, to my current focus, which is really on organizational and HR practices. And I now have the joy of leading Titus as we continue to grow our own people. I'm definitely happy to have some other experts on the topic today who are going to be sharing their thoughts and their experiences as well. And I just simply have the pleasure of moderating for once, as Mike's saying he was glad I was moderating, but it's nice to be able to sit back a little bit. So Tiffany, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about who you are today, since you're new to our panel.
Yes, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. I grew up as a recruiter. I started recruiting back in 2009, which was probably the worst time in history to be in recruiting, but we made it through. And so I joined Titus also as a recruiter, and then I've had the opportunity to grow, and now I manage a team of recruiters, and I have the pleasure of working directly with our partners, our clients, ensuring success and managing those relationships. So it's been a great ride.
Awesome. And I said new to the panel, but definitely not new to Titus. Tiffany's been here for some time and has made such an impact on the organization. And then we have our returning guest, Mr. Mike Kinsey.
Thanks, Raina. I've already received feedback today from you that I didn't wear a jacket today.
Yeah,
both of my colleagues wear a jacket.
Each their own. If you want to keep up with Tiffany and I, you got to get into the style, fashion.
I never will. But yes, thank you, Raina. So my name is Mike Kinsey. I lead our talent optimization division, and it's filled with a lot of really incredibly talented people. I'm just really fortunate to work with the people that are on the team. And our goal on a team is to help partners maximize the potential for each of their people. And that's just a ton of fun. We've got experts that do coaching and training, and they leverage a lot of tools like the Predictive Index, which is our in-house behavioral and cognitive assessment. So I'm really honored and excited to be here today.
Yeah, we're actually going to talk a little bit about PI in one of our slides later this conversation as well. So great introduction. And then for the audience, while we can't see you, sadly, you're stuck looking at us, but we don't get to see you. We can see the interactions in the chat feature. So if you want to take a moment and just type in where you're located and what your role is. A lot of people find out that they want to connect with others through LinkedIn after our sessions. You may have some commonalities or common questions or common issues that you want to connect on. And clearly, if you have a question, throw it in the chat. It's a bit hard to speak and watch the chat feature, but thank goodness we have Tiffany and Mike to help as well. If we can't get to your question during the conversation, we should have some time at the end to answer those questions that pop up as well. And good to see you all from all over the place, from Florida all the way to San Diego. We got a lot of people here from across the country, which is really representative of our partner base because we are a national organization. So great to see you all here today. So always fun when we get to a stats page, because I could nerd out on stats. And I think stats are only important when we really understand the correlation of the statistic to what it is that we're trying to talk about. So Tasha Eurich is an organizational psychologist who studies self-awareness. And she found that 95% of people think they're self-aware, but only 10 to 15% actually are. This is a bit of an issue because she found significant correlations between self-awareness and how people perform. And she also found significant correlations between self-awareness and leadership effectiveness. So for my co-speakers today and our audience members, there's no need to share names. That's one reason the audience is muted, just in case we want to blurt out something we shouldn't say. but I'm guessing most of us have actually worked for someone who wasn't self-aware, and we probably wanted to provide them some feedback. In all seriousness, the point of the slide is that thinking we're self-aware is simply not enough. We have to find a way to get feedback from others because it can really lead us to what we would call acute self-awareness, which allows us to perform better and be more effective in the job that we do. We all have blind spots. We should just recognize that. And as our glorious CEO visionary, Jonathan Reynolds, reminds us, they're called blind spots because we can't see them. So we need others to tell us our blind spots so that we can improve. We need to get comfortable getting feedback, but here's the deal. Getting feedback is generally not very easy. It can be quite difficult. So as I was asked to moderate this, I did chuckle a bit because I saw that Tiffany was going to be on the panel, and it brought me back to a time where Tiffany, my now good friend and colleague, provided me with some feedback. It was really early on in my time with Titus, where I was still building my internal brand, which is incredibly important, I think, when you're coming into an organization to kind of learn the politics of the business and get comfortable with people and build those relationships. And Tiffany, I do want to tell the story. Do you want to tell, or do you want me to tell my iteration?
You can tell it and then I'll correct you.
I love it. See, she'll give me feedback in the moment while I receive it, which will be really good. But early on in my time here is actually building a training. And we have a ton of expert recruiters here and people that are strong interviewers. So there's a little bit of pressure to build this training and to be really comfortable in delivering this to the entire organization. So I did need some help with the content. I was trying to be sweet and unassuming with my friend Tiffany. And I probably said something, I don't remember the exact details. So this is where Tiffany can correct me. But I did say something like, would you have time to assist me, dear? I don't recall if there was like this immediate nonverbal feedback crossing her face, but she did politely respond to my question about assisting. And then later in the call, she simply said, can I give you some feedback? At which point of time I said, yes, where she told me that she really hates being called dear. I think that's pretty accurate. Is that accurate, Tiffany?
That is all accurate, and not to have a spoiler alert, but it did make our relationship stronger too. And now we can totally laugh and joke about it. And it was uncomfortable for me to give the feedback, but ultimately we laughed about it now, and it ended up being a really cool milestone in our relationship together.
Yeah, she did also tell me that now I can call her dear. I just couldn't in the beginning before she knew me. So I think we're all squared away. I know it seems like something so small, but it's difficult to hear feedback, not because we don't need it, but it means that we weren't perfect in our approach or delivery based on someone else's standard or someone else's perception. That's what makes it hard for most people. And while I meant my comment of dear to be sweet, it didn't have that effect. I didn't have the relationship with Tiffany. It came across as condescending in her mind. And I appreciated that she did feel really comfortable and empowered to provide the feedback. And it certainly made me think about using the word dear with anyone outside of my mother, and only because my mother thinks it's cute. So I can say it there, but it does reframe your thinking a little bit about the impact your words or behaviors can have on other people. So Mike, since you've been sitting there nicely, why is receiving criticism really difficult for you personally?
But who told you it was difficult for me personally? It is. It
actually
is.
I know you're a little bit. I know you're a little.
It is. I mean, I grew up with a lot of words of affirmation and support from family and friends. And I love and appreciate that, from the people in my life. I think the downside of it, though, is that it started to really shape me into fearing imperfection of myself. And it also didn't really create or stimulate that desire to stretch myself into being uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And with that, it made it really difficult for me in school to overcome adversity and fight my own fights. And that's a big thing that I think is really important for people. And so over the years, I really had to learn how growth is really more of being stretched and challenged, because in really most aspects of life, growth comes with a lot of discomfort.
Yeah, Mike, I mean, I really appreciate the fact that you grew up in a family where you had a lot of affirmation and support. And while I feel like I definitely got that, I had the dad who would tell me after I scored like 25 points in a basketball game, you know what, you could have done better. So I think I've been receiving feedback from very early age, especially because my father was my coach,
Yes.
I mean, all of us on the call have had the responsibility of providing guidance or feedback to team members over the course of our careers, but we've also been on the receiving end. And while it will always be a little hard to receive feedback, we know the importance of receiving it. but more importantly, it's likely that it's important that we receive it well, because it is a gift. So Tiffany, on our last webinar, I did share the acronym for GIFT. Can you just repeat that for our audience who maybe weren't able to attend, and then share your thoughts on feedback?
Full transparency, I did not know that GIFT was also an acronym. I thought it was truly just you're gifted by feedback. So this was fun when I went and read the notes on what I was supposed to say during the slide. So thanks for that. But GIFT is given with permission, intent is for growth, for a person, not about a person, and targeted for success. And this is good to keep in mind when you are receiving feedback and when you're giving feedback, because if you're anything like me, I'm a super huge perfectionist. I have a lot of really high standards for myself. And so responding to criticism gratefully was not always easy for me. And I had an older sister who loved to dish out the criticism. So unlike Mike's perfect angelic childhood, I had a lot of feedback growing up. But honestly, it can leave you feeling defensive. It can leave you feeling deflated, self-conscious. And so part of why we wanted to talk to you all today is that we want you to come prepared to a feedback conversation and have the tools and the right mindset to receive the feedback and then grow from it and learn from it.
And Paula, we
I went with too fast on the acronym.
The chat, don't worry.
Okay.
So Kinsey, given with permission, intent is for growth, for a person, not about a person. And we want it to be targeted to help that individual be successful. But we love you, Paula, and you can give us feedback anytime.
Thank you for the feedback, Paula. So with that, if you guys could just pop in some responses to the chat. If I were to call you up and say, hey, can I give you some feedback? What would be your initial feelings? What would be your initial response to yourself in your head? Go ahead and pop those in the chat.
And Tiffany, while we're waiting for responses, what are your initial thoughts when someone asks you that question?
Scared.
Mike, what about you?
It's a sinking feeling. Yeah, immediate anxiety. I think how Sandy said it is exactly the way I would feel.
What did I do wrong?
Yeah, what did I do wrong? I when I hear it, I automatically think, uh-oh, am I ready to hear this? I better take a deep breath so I can act like I'm ready, even if I'm not ready. I love that. Oh boy. Initial is the uh-oh. What else are you saying, Tiffany?
Oh boy. Yeah, definitely. It's never a positive thing, right? It's never like, oh, yay, can't wait. Let's have this conversation right now. It's like, okay, I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
So this is a good transition because we found that the first things that come to mind when we hear something like that is we want to deny and we want to deflect. So we can talk a little bit about the next slide here. So 3 most common responses when you receive feedback. The first 2 are usually natural and totally normal, which are deny and deflect. And then the third is understand. And if you're a completely 100% emotionally mature person with absolutely no flaws, maybe you go to understand right away, but it's more likely that you will go to deny and deflect in most cases. And some of this will be learned over the course of your career journey, depending on where you are and the type of people that you surround yourself with. But it does take practice, just like anything else, to move to that understand section.
Tiffany, I love that you kind of just preface, if you're like this perfect, emotionally intelligent human being, you're going to immediately go to this whole idea of understand. And we could even say, we know that some of you on this call might not struggle to receive feedback because you might already be in that space in your career where you've learned to accept it graciously and you've seen what it's done for you. But you might be leading others who do struggle receiving criticism or feedback. So our hope is that we do provide you some takeaways that you can share within your organization to help those that are receiving feedback to receive it graciously.
So let's start with deny. That's not true. That didn't happen. One example that comes to mind for me, I give this feedback a lot now working with more junior recruiters, but I know coming up in the business, you're talking to high level people at all times. You know, you might be 1 year into your career and you're talking to an executive about hiring an associate for them. And something that comes up a lot in our world are filler words. Now, I'm not trying to get into Raina and Mike's heads right now because they're like, do I say do I say like? But that's one that comes up a lot in our business. And it's an easy one for people to pick on when you're asking, I want more executive presence, I want to be more effective on calls with this hiring leader or with this executive. And that's a really easy one for people to pick. It's low hanging fruit. You say or like a lot in the last conversation that you had. And it's really quick to say, no, I didn't. I've been trying really hard and I did not do that. So that's one example that just came really top of mind to me as I was thinking about this presentation.
Yeah, and Tiffany, I guess in that situation, what do you think is going to happen if the receiver of that feedback just simply denies what you have to say?
I think they're going to shut down, and it's going to be one of those things where the relationship is not built. Like the deer. Now Raina and I have a kind of a funny, more lighthearted relationship where nothing can be worse than her calling me dear at this point. She can give me any feedback from no one else, and it wouldn't be as bad as that. But for deny, you can certainly say that internally, like, did I do that? But then it's always better to just thank them for the feedback, think about it, and consider it for the future, and try to, just really pay attention to it for next time.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is the sneaky part earlier where I said Mike's going to talk a little bit about PI in this presentation. So given that you are the expert in Predictive Index, our favorite behavioral assessment tool, do you notice that there are certain profiles that tend to slide into deny as their first response to feedback?
In a way, I think, let me explain it with an example. I think it might be easier to kind of put it together is something what Tiffany had just said about, do I do that in that reflection piece? When you look at somebody who is a higher extrovert, so somebody that has a stronger need to have social interaction with other people, it often comes with a behavior that they like to process information out loud. So imagine that if you speak to think, a lot of those ideas aren't going to be fully baked yet. So your first initial response externally and outwardly might be to deny that information has happened as you're processing that information. And that can come across really negatively to people that are giving the feedback. And on the other side of it, we've got the lower B trait, what we would say is the introverts on the team that actually do need some time to process information. And if you're throwing information at them, that denial could be a very natural response until they've had proper time to really think and let those thoughts bake. So it's really important to know your teammates. That's one of the big things, is understand how they may receive that information and how outwardly that may look, because there can be some misconceptions of how they're actually feeling or what they truly think. And so it often is a defense mechanism, just like the next one that we're going to talk about here is a good segue into deflection is a defense mechanism that we really should dig into a little bit more deeply. And I wanted to make sure I run this because I really consider myself a recovering deflector, a master deflector of sorts, because I think this is almost as bad as flat up denying it. But it's really common. I think this is probably the most common reaction that we see. It's because it's a tactic where someone's actually trying to avoid criticism. They're blame shifting. Yeah. They're putting that focus of responsibility on somebody else.
Yeah, deflecting feels a lot like when you ask a child while they're fighting with their sibling and they're like, oh, he started it. I mean, here's where I really get excited because my background is psychology, but deflection is really a psychological defense mechanism for us. And it's a way of protecting ourselves from experiencing those really uncomfortable emotions that Tiffany mentioned earlier, the anxiety, the shame, the guilt, the distress, the I'm not perfect, if that's kind of inherently in your being. And I think this response actually does the opposite of what people hope it does, which they think it might make them look better, or it really wasn't my fault. They're not accountable to it. And instead it does the opposite of that. It makes the person less believable. It makes them seem like they're less genuine compared to someone who really owns the feedback that you're trying to provide.
Yeah, it's hard. It is about protecting yourself. It's protecting your self-image. It's what we call ego defense, right? It's if somebody feels inadequate, you are deflecting that and pushing that focus everywhere else that you can. And so I think back of some of the first times that I had done trainings with big groups of people, and I would send that survey, which can sometimes feel like a formality until you receive the feedback and it comes back, and it's, people can be brutally honest, especially when their name's not attached to it. When you're getting that confidential information, it's pretty raw. And it hits, and I would sit with my manager and we'd go through this information, and my initial response is, well, I get what they're saying, but it's because they weren't remembering the things that we learned about in the first half of the training. And there's always that excuse, and there's every kind of excuse or everything imaginable that you can think of. And I can't imagine how my manager felt during that time. And so I would flip this to you, Tiffany. So as a leader, when your direct reports deflect feedback, how does it make you feel? And what is your perception of them, or how does that change the relationship?
Yeah, that does happen. And honestly, I think that deflecting accomplishes the exact opposite of what you think it is. You're trying to shine light on somebody else or something else versus yourself, but it's actually shining a more negative light on yourself. So it's good to practice reflecting and trying to get away from the deflect as your initial reaction. But to answer your question, I try to really proactively deposit into my relationships with my team. I like to use that metaphor because you want to fill them up with positive feedback and love and support when they're doing things well, so that when the time comes that you need to withdraw from that relationship with more of a negative piece of feedback, that your relationship is strong enough to where it's going to land a little bit differently, and give them the safe space then to deflect potentially and bounce that off of you. But that does happen. And I just try to be really honest with them and be really consistent with my feedback, both positive and negative, so that it's not coming out of nowhere. It's not surprising to them. My goal is to have it be something that they're expecting to hear. Like, I'll go back to I just use but I'll go back to the filler words. I might call them after an update meeting with the client, and they'll be like, I know I said, I know you're going to say that. That's the ultimate goal as a leader, is to be consistent and be somebody that they can trust and they can lean on, and they know that they can expect feedback from you, both positive and constructive, not just, more of the negative stuff.
Tiffany, it's interesting that you're talking a little bit about creating that emotional bank. I mean, that's what you're doing. You're creating this bank of emotion and relationships so that when you have to dive into the deep stuff, it's more comfortable because they already have the relationship. And I think that's a good thing for all of us to be thinking about, is how really feedback becomes part of our normal rhythm of conversation. We mentioned feedback culture in the beginning. It shouldn't feel scary for your person to get feedback from you when it becomes normalized. I think the hard thing is, I did this last week with an individual who's not on my team. And I said, hey, do you mind if I would provide some feedback in the next couple of days just to help you grow for the future? And the individual, I think they were really nervous, more likely because they don't report to me and they don't normally receive feedback from me. But had it been their own manager, it probably would have been a little less scary, a little less anxiety producing. So having the relationship is going to help us to be able to cycle into that when we need to. And then Paula, I see your question over here. So you're a details person. You often feel that feedback is given with support details that are unrelated to the actual feedback. If you argue the details, is that considered deflection? We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the understand slide, because I think when we get to understand, there's a lot of things about asking questions and getting curious. So it's really, I would say it can feel like deflection rather than being more curious and asking the questions. And sometimes the details are really irrelevant, but we'll come to that a little bit more in the understand section. Thank you for the question.
That's really good. The other piece of this too, and Tiffany, I know you're pretty empathetic and you're protective of your teammates. I've seen that before. And so I'm curious if you've almost deflected on someone's behalf before, and if you feel like that's better, worse, the same as deflecting on your own behalf.
Good question. And thanks for calling me out. We have a lot of cross working within Titus. I don't always manage my own people. My peers and my teammates a lot of times manage my people, and vice versa. And so there's a lot of feedback circles that happen, whether they give the feedback directly to someone who reports to me, or they give it to me and ask what my preference is. Do I want to deliver it to them, or should they do it directly? And I've most certainly deflected on behalf of my person, because one example was most recently that another account manager came to me and said, I have one of your recruiters working on one of my searches, and they're just not meeting expectations. They're not getting results, and don't have enough activities. And my first thought was, that can't be true, because that's uncharacteristic of that person. So my first initial internal was, deflect, like that can't possibly be true. But on the external, I thanked them for their feedback, and I asked if it would be okay if I spoke to the person first. And so I was able to investigate, ask more questions. I didn't come out with it right away and say, so-and-so said this, can you confirm or deny? I just asked them, hey, what's going on? is everything okay? You know, anything going on in your personal life? I know you mentioned this happened the last couple of weeks. Has that been resolved? And then I was able to uncover a little bit of personal items that were coming into their work. And so my initial response of that can't be possible was very quickly, you know, deflated, because I'm like, okay, actually it is possible, and it's more of an external situation. And so then I was able to go back to the person and let them know, like, hey, this is going on. It's not an excuse. It's not acceptable. But just so you know, I'd be more than happy if you wanted to have a talk with them or even take action to remove them from the search. And so it was a really productive conversation.
We like to call those things going on in people's lives precipitating factors. So sometimes there are, rather than call them excuses, we should think about reasons. I mean, people have a life outside of work. Things can bleed in. There can be things piling up that definitely can impact people's response in that moment. So Tiffany, that was nice of you to go back and explain the situation with the individual. Mike, you had said that there's a question from Megan. So the question, I found it, says, how do you recommend responding when the perception and the feedback may not be accurate without denying or deflecting and being defensive? This is going to take us off track for just a moment, but it is a really powerful question. It's really, how do you respond professionally when you truly disagree with the feedback that's being offered? And here's the thing, responding professionally when you disagree with feedback is crucial for maintaining positive working relationships and fostering a constructive environment. So here's how you might respond to that question. First, when you encounter that and you genuinely disagree with the feedback you've received, approach it as an opportunity for growth and a chance to foster productive discussion. So turn it into a discussion. My typical response would probably be something like pause and reflect before responding. Just take some time to reflect, assess whether the initial disagreement is rooted in defensive reaction or if there's really a genuine merit to the perspective that's coming from the individual and then my own perspective. I would definitely seek clarification, which I'll save that description for the next slide because we're going to get to understand in just a moment. I would definitely look to find common ground. So I aim to find the areas of agreement within the feedback, even if I disagree with certain aspects or the facts, such as like Paula already asked the question about, there might be elements that I can acknowledge and agree upon. So maybe I don't agree with everything, but there could be things that I do agree with, and I want to acknowledge that. This is going to help us to establish a positive tone for the conversation. I think you can express your perspective without denying or deflecting. You can do that in a really respectful, non-confrontational way. You can focus on providing evidence or examples that would support your own viewpoint in a way, again, conversationally rather than an offensive way, while also acknowledging that validity, the validity of the feedback that you're receiving. And then maybe find a middle ground. You know, depending on the situation, you might find a compromise or a middle ground that might be possible. And that really just demonstrates your flexibility and your willingness to collaborate. So there's a lot of different things that you can do in that moment. But I think finding that common ground, acknowledging the things that might be true, determining if there's a common pattern, maybe you've heard it before, where you can agree and acknowledge. Those would be some of the techniques that I would suggest.
I would also add on to that too, Raina, that it would be important to put some space between those conversations, because if somebody offers you feedback that you don't agree with, you probably will be tempted to respond emotionally versus tactfully or factually. So I definitely agree that you need to stand up for yourself and you definitely need to be confident in your point of view. But my biggest advice would be to step away and ask for some time to reflect. And so you can come back to the conversation with much clearer perspective on it.
That's really good. Thank you, Tiffany. I mean, if we're always justifying our behaviors, we're going to miss out on these serious growth opportunities. So rather than deny or deflect feedback, which again is our more natural response to criticism, we do need to train ourselves or upskill ourselves in seeking to understand, which is really the final bit that we wanted to talk about today. We would consider seeking to understand one of the best responses to feedback, because when we're receiving feedback, we should be listening and waiting to respond immediately. As Tiffany just said, maybe you need to create a little bit of space. Those immediate responses tend to be reactions instead of responses. So we should be seeking to respond. And in that moment where you really want to blurt something out, even though you know it's not the right way to respond professionally, it simply just need to take a moment to reflect, to step for a moment, reflect on what was being said to you. Just like giving feedback is an art, I should say, I would insert shameless plug for our next webinar, which is how to actually ensure that your feedback is effective. receiving and responding to feedback is a skill, and it's something that we can learn. So Tiffany, since we'll likely learn something through feedback, can you talk about the importance of asking questions as the receiver once you give the feedback?
Yeah, definitely. And we touched on this a little bit just before, but I would recommend thanking them for their feedback, because I don't know, I'm sure all of you have given feedback, right? And it's hard. Like, you get sweaty, your heart rate increases, you don't want to do it, but you know you have to, because it's going to strengthen the relationship. It's going to help that person in future interactions, depending on what the feedback is. And a lot of times the feelings that you felt when you heard the phrase, "Can I give you some feedback?" that person is feeling them as they're typing or saying, "Can I give you some feedback?" So it's important to see from their perspective and to remain curious and thank them for their feedback. And so that way you can ask some questions to follow up. You can give your brain a little bit of time to process, to allow the emotions to flow through, and to come prepared with some more questions and some more follow-up. One example comes to mind for me, and I actually just gave feedback just last week to one of Raina's direct reports, and I haven't told her yet, and I probably won't, because it was between us and we solved it. But anyways, I was really nervous because I don't have an emotional bank with that person. I work with them very rarely. I do have a lot of respect for the person, but she was on a call with us and just did not handle a situation the way I thought it could have best been handled. So I was super nervous to give her this feedback. It's quite possible that she would have, hung up on me or deflected or asked for 100 examples that I wasn't prepared to give. But, I put myself out there, and I did reach out and I said, "Hey, I have some feedback. Can we chat?" And I had to schedule it for a few hours later, which was awful because I was nervous that whole time and she was nervous that whole time, I'm assuming. But it went great. I told her my point of view. She thanked me for the feedback, and she said, "Wow, I really appreciate you telling me that, because otherwise I would have gone into so many future calls doing that exact same thing." And it's really nice to hear your perspective as the account manager on how that landed for you. And it was a really cool moment for me, because she's young in her career. She handled it super maturely. But then to the points we were making earlier, she did say, "Well, here's why I did that." And so I could understand. So I knew it wasn't malicious. I knew that it wasn't her trying to sabotage something, that she truly thought that it was an effective point to add. And after further conversation, I could see her side of it, but I still said, here's a way that you could still get your point across without being so strict on it. And so it was a really productive conversation and really beneficial. And we both walked away from it, I can assume from her end, growing and learning a little bit about both of our different roles within Titus and how we can work together to be effective with our clients.
Well, Tiffany, because I don't know the situation, I'm so glad that my person received your feedback with grace, because we do provide a lot of feedback on my team. It is a normal part of our routine, so I appreciate that. I mean, it can be really hard to respond without emotion immediately after feedback is given. So we want you all to know it's okay to ask for time to process and reflect, especially when Mike has already talked about the different types of behavioral profiles and who might need the time to reflect before responding to something that was given. We want you to all give your brain a chance or opportunity to respond in an organized manner rather than reacting emotionally to what's being given to you. It can also show that you're really taking the feedback seriously if you ask for time to process it. So Mike, who is sitting here so quiet and so patiently, can you talk about how to be proactive in your response to feedback, because it can be a real game changer?
No one has ever accused me of being quiet or patient. So I really appreciate that, Raina. That's great. So yes, I mean, one of the things is starting with processing the feedback, but you have to create a plan on habits that will help you improve. I am not really a habitual person. And so this is a big stretch for me. And I know it's a big stretch for a lot of different people that don't like routine and repetition, but if somebody is giving you, for example, some feedback that you have a very poor attention to detail, you do need to flex, and you need to sit down and you need to create a process or a checklist that will work specifically for you. What can you do that's efficient? What can you do that's repeatable? And what can you do to make sure that there aren't those distractions that are going to bog you down so that your attention to detail is going to be less? Because again, people are wired in certain ways, and not everybody is going to be great with attention to detail. It's if you're going to get your wrist slapped for the times that you're making mistakes, there's only so many opportunities you're going to get. You do need to receive that feedback. And so I've seen a lot of teammates sink or swim when they've received constructive feedback. And it's some of the most organized people that I know are actually not naturally that way. They've done it to make sure that they're successful. They've made sure that they found routines that work specifically for them. And otherwise, I think they start to see themselves fail time and time again. And that is not what we're looking for. It's about growth.
Yeah, Mike, I think to your point, you can only lean into, well, that's just naturally who I am. So many times I remember being a facilitator and coaching other new facilitators, and they would say, well, I'm just sarcastic naturally. And I would say, that's fine, but you have to flex in the situation because you don't know the people you're speaking to, and your sarcasm doesn't always come across as funny. It comes across as condescending. And so you have to take that feedback and do something with it rather than being like, well, that's just naturally who I am. It's naturally who I am. I mean, thank you for all of the great suggestions on how we can really help us own the feedback that we're given. And what's not listed here on the slide, but it's probably a good habit to follow up with the person who has provided you with the feedback and share your plan. You might even ask them to help you with accountability. I think about all the people I coach, and I just love it when they create a plan for skill development and then ask me to continue providing feedback where they still need to grow or where they're excelling in the change of behavior. I think a lot of individuals I've coached on executive presence would be like, okay, I'm speaking today. Can you make sure you're there so that you can provide me feedback? Or, hey, did you see how I handled that on the huddle today in front of everybody? So there's a lot to be said for that person being grateful for, but then also asking for continued help with accountability. I saw a question from Amy up above, which is basically, how do you recommend we provide feedback in a way that's not too direct, but not too soft? And I feel like this is a really tough one for most people because you do want to be gentle in the way that you're providing feedback. But what I will say is if you don't give direct feedback, sometimes it creates confusion for the person. There was kind of this old way of giving feedback, which was like the hamburger, say something nice, say something critical, follow it with something nice. And while that might seem like a good thing to do, I think it confuses the person. They're leaving wondering, what am I actually supposed to do with that? Was it a big deal or wasn't it a big deal? Because it seems like I'm doing most things right. Tiffany or Mike, do you have thoughts on a response to that?
Yeah, I mean, just to add a little bit to it is I think just honesty in itself is a gift to somebody. Being honest is the right thing to do. So the goal is to not mince words, like you're saying, Raina, and show care, show empathy. But the big thing that I've seen a lot of really good leaders do is they just explain the why behind it. Why is it important to you and why is it important to them? Because that's going to be the ideal situation. And I would also say that we can sometimes hide behind our keyboards. So try to get face-to-face or on the phone as much as you can so they can hear your care, hear your tone. And then you can follow up with a recap of that written, which is usually, I think, received a lot better.
Perfect. And I'm going to answer one more question before we close things out, because I know I'm going to get in trouble if we get to 11:45 Central Time and I haven't gotten through the rest of the slides. So Tiffany, I'm going to send this question to you from Hamed, which is, how do you pave the way for people who are bottom up giving feedback versus top down manager to subordinate necessarily?
That is a really good question. And as a middle manager, this is very, very real to me. Mm-hmm. And I think the same goes with the metaphor that we've been using, the deposit, because the more that you provide feedback to your upper level supervisor, somebody who's at a higher level that you don't necessarily report to, and the more you ask for feedback, like, hey, how do you feel I did on that last call? That can open up the door for someone that may not be as comfortable providing feedback to make them more comfortable and just make that more of a normal part of your working dynamic. Because you can't assume just because somebody is at a higher level than you or that they have direct reports that they're really good or comfortable with giving feedback. So sometimes it is on you to open that door, unfortunately, but then you're destined for greatness if you already are accomplishing some of those higher level tasks at, you know, a lower level, you could say. But sometimes you do have to be the facilitator and the catalyst for some of that stuff, just to make that a normal part of your dynamic.
Yeah, one of the great tools that we have in Predictive Index is called a manager strategy guide. It really helps you to open the door to that conversation formally a couple of times a year, where you're basically saying, I know this is what you need in order to be successful. Am I hitting the mark for you? So it's a tool that you basically you're assessing yourself and asking your team member to assess you as well. And you come together and just have an open conversation about it, so that it is more planful, time to process, and you're asking for the feedback. But to Tiffany's point, we should all be asking for feedback so that we can learn from the people around us. That 360 degree is so incredibly important. So these are all the things we talked about, just a handful of the tips to help us better understand and respond to feedback. And responding to feedback, as we've already said, is just one piece of the puzzle that we're trying to solve for. We hope you've enjoyed the first two parts of our Feedback as a Gift series. Hopefully you've been able to attend them all. The first session was really about how to ask for feedback. This one is really how to receive it. And the next part of our series is going to be focused on the feedback giver, because man, if we ask for feedback, let's just hope the person providing it has the skill set in place to deliver the feedback really well for us. So we want to see you at our next session, if at all possible. We know some of you have to hop before we get to the Q&A, and quite honestly, we've answered a lot of questions during, which thank you so much for the questions. I'm sure others have them. We won't have much time for Q&A after. If you do need something, you can link to us through Facebook. We're going to throw up a code in a moment for you as well, where you can get a hold of our learning and development director if you have some questions that we weren't able to get to today. But our next series is Feedback. Is your feedback effective? We'll have Mike back, myself back. Sorry, you're stuck with us again. But we'll have Jack Letizia joining us. She is a director for us in one of other divisions at Titus. She's a wealth of knowledge, a voice you don't want to miss. And you can grab this QR code off the slide to save your seat. And I'll give you just a second to do that before I have them switch to the next slide. And then finally, just know that everything that you've heard here today is just a small snippet of our larger course called Feedback as a Gift. And we love to provide these trainings in your group settings, your team settings, because we can do a little bit of customizing to make it really, really relevant to you. Time and again, we're told there's more high quality feedback circulating on teams once we get through these conversations and talk about feedback openly within the organization, with the goal always trying to be creating the culture of feedback. So use this QR code if you'd like some time with our Director of Learning and Development, Stacy Volz. She is the queen of talent optimization, whose goal is to help you build your high-performing team. So we don't have much time for questions. Please reach out to us on LinkedIn. We're certainly happy, or grab the code for Stacy so that she can meet with you as well. But thank you so much for your time today, panelists, and thank you so much for all of you in the audience that were willing to put the questions out there and interact with us. We always appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.